She was frozen solid, Caleb Mercer whispered, his voice barely louder than the wind, as he knelt in the endless white silence that swallowed the mountains of northern Montana before dawn. For one suspended heartbeat, even the storm seemed to listen. The German shepherd lay half-buried beneath a shell of wind-packed snow, her sable coat glazed with frost until she looked more like a forgotten statue than a living soul. Ice clung to every strand of fur, crystals shimmered across her eyelashes, and the bitter air stole every trace of warmth from the world around them. Caleb had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL. He had crossed deserts where the sand burned through boots, oceans that swallowed sound, and mountains where survival was measured one breath at a time. He knew what death looked like. It rarely announced itself. It simply arrived quietly, settled in, and refused to leave. This looked no different. His gloved hand rested gently against the side of the dog's neck. Nothing. No movement. No visible breath. Only cold. Endless, unforgiving cold. Above them, snow drifted lazily from a sky the color of weathered steel, carried by a wind that hummed through the pines like a distant hymn. The scent of frozen cedar mixed with the clean sharpness of mountain air, while somewhere beyond the ridge, a lone raven called into the emptiness before disappearing into the storm. Caleb closed his eyes for only a second. He wasn't praying. He wasn't even sure he remembered how. But something inside him refused to walk away. Maybe it was the old promise every operator silently carried home after too many missions. Never leave anyone behind, human or otherwise. He carefully brushed snow away from the dog's face. Beneath the ice, her features were gentle despite the hardship she had endured. One ear remained folded beneath the frost. A worn leather collar peeked through frozen fur, cracked with age, its metal tag buried beneath a thin layer of ice that refused to give up its secrets. Whoever she had belonged to was nowhere in sight. Whoever had loved her had not come back. Caleb swallowed against the knot rising in his throat. The wind pushed harder, rattling the skeletal branches overhead, urging him to keep moving before daylight disappeared behind another wall of snow. Every instinct born from years of survival whispered the same thing. Leave now. Save yourself. But another voice, quieter and older, refused to surrender. He slipped off one glove despite the biting cold and placed two bare fingers beneath her jaw one final time, more out of respect than hope. His skin instantly burned against the ice. Nothing. He exhaled slowly, the cloud of warm breath drifting across her frozen muzzle. I'm sorry, girl, he murmured, his words carried into the white silence. He reached for the edge of his thermal blanket, preparing to wrap her with the dignity every fallen companion deserved before carrying her away from the mountain. Then, just as his hand brushed across her face, something so small that any other person might have dismissed it as imagination stopped him cold. Beneath the thin layer of frost covering her left eye, one tiny eyelash trembled. Caleb froze where he knelt, scarcely trusting his own eyes as the tiny movement disappeared almost as quickly as it had come. The mountain remained silent, offering no explanation, only the endless whisper of snow drifting across frozen earth. He leaned closer until his face was only inches from the German shepherd's muzzle. His own breath clouded the air between them before dissolving into the bitter wind. He waited. 5 long seconds passed. Then another 5. Every lesson years of survival had taught him insisted that hope could become the most dangerous illusion a man could carry. Yet something inside him refused to let the moment go. Carefully, he brushed another layer of frost away from the dog's closed eyelid with the back of his bare fingers. The ice had begun to soften beneath the warmth of his touch, revealing fur darker than the snow had allowed him to see before. Her face looked peaceful, almost asleep, as though winter itself had tucked her into an endless dream. Caleb listened again, lowering his ear toward her nose despite the wind cutting across the ridge. At first, there was nothing except the distant groan of pine trees bending beneath fresh snow. Then, so faint it almost vanished before he believed it, a whisper of warm air grazed his cheek. One breath, weak enough to disappear into the cold, slow enough to escape anyone who had already decided she was gone. His heart tightened. Instinct immediately replaced uncertainty. He shrugged off his heavy pack and pulled free a compact emergency blanket, wrapping it around the rigid body with deliberate care. The material crackled against the ice as he tucked it beneath her sides, trapping every fragment of warmth he could preserve. She did not move. She did not open her eyes again. But she had breathed. That was enough. Caleb lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, far lighter than a healthy German shepherd should have been, as though the winter had stolen not only her warmth but pieces of her very existence. Frost clung to his jacket as he stood, the extra weight pressing against old injuries that still reminded him of missions he rarely spoke about. The hike back to his cabin stretched nearly 2 miles through uneven terrain hidden beneath fresh snowfall. Under normal conditions, it was manageable. Today, every step demanded patience. The wind strengthened, carrying tiny needles of ice that stung his face while visibility faded to little more than a curtain of white. Caleb adjusted his grip without loosening the blanket around her. Her head rested against his chest, perfectly still, while the faint rhythm of his own heartbeat echoed through the silence between them. He found himself speaking without thinking, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You are not staying here. Not today." The word surprised him. He had spent years learning how to stay silent, how to bury grief beneath discipline, how to keep memories locked behind walls no one else could enter. Yet speaking to this stranger somehow felt natural, as though the mountain itself had entrusted her to him for reasons he could not yet understand. Ahead, through swirling snow, the faint outline of smoke finally rose above a line of dark pines. His small log cabin stood alone against the wilderness, its chimney offering the first promise of warmth either of them had seen since dawn. Caleb tightened the blanket once more and kept walking, unaware that beneath the folds of silver fabric, one frozen paw twitched ever so slightly. The cabin door groaned shut behind Caleb, sealing out the roar of the storm and replacing it with a quieter world filled only with the crackling of oak logs inside the cast-iron stove. Warm amber light flickered across rough pine walls that had witnessed many lonely winters, filling the single room with the comforting scent of burning cedar and old coffee. Snow melted from Caleb's boots onto the worn wooden floor as he carried the motionless German shepherd to the thick wool rug beside the fire. He knelt carefully, lowering her onto folded blankets before removing the silver emergency wrap inch by inch. Frost still coated her fur in delicate crystals that sparkled under the firelight like tiny stars refusing to fade. Her breathing remained almost impossible to detect. Caleb reached for another blanket from an old cedar chest, wrapping it gently around her rigid body while keeping her head elevated. He knew enough about cold weather survival to understand that rushing warmth could sometimes do more harm than patience. Slow, steady, respect the body, respect the fight it was already waging. He placed a kettle onto the stove and watched thin curls of steam begin to rise. The familiar routine steadied his breathing. Every movement had purpose. Every decision demanded calm. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the windows as though winter itself wanted to reclaim what had been taken from the mountain. Caleb ignored it. He soaked a clean towel in warm, not hot, water and gently pressed it against her frozen paws one at a time. The stiffness remained. He moved to her ears, then her shoulders, speaking quietly all the while. "You made it this far. Keep going." The words sounded strange in the empty room. Months had passed since another voice had answered his own. Retirement had brought silence instead of peace. Friends called less often. Missions became memories. Even laughter felt like something that belonged to another lifetime. Yet somehow speaking to this silent companion did not feel lonely. It felt necessary. As the minutes stretched toward an hour, tiny beads of melted frost dampened the blankets beneath her. Her coat slowly revealed its rich sable colors beneath the ice, darker along her back, lighter around her chest, with faint silver strands around her muzzle that suggested years of hardship rather than age. Caleb finally managed to free the weathered leather collar from beneath frozen fur. The brass tag was scratched almost smooth. He rubbed it gently with the corner of his sleeve until a single word emerged beneath the soot and time. "Freya." He read it aloud, almost smiling. "So that is your name." The sound of it settled warmly inside the cabin. Freya. It suited her somehow. Strong, quiet, enduring. He set the collar carefully beside the stove before checking her breathing once more. This time his fingertips sensed something different. A pulse. It was faint, slow, and uneven, but unmistakably there. Relief washed across his face before discipline reminded him that survival was still uncertain. He poured a small amount of lukewarm water into a shallow bowl, moistening her lips with the edge of a cloth rather than forcing her to drink. Then he sat back against the nearby wall, exhausted without realizing it, keeping his eyes fixed on the rise and fall of her chest. The fire continued its gentle rhythm, filling the room with warmth while snow piled silently against the windows. Nearly another hour passed before the impossible happened. Without warning, Freya's ears twitched once, followed by the smallest quiver beneath her closed eyelids, and then, with a fragile breath that sounded almost like a sigh, her chest rose just a little deeper than before. Freya's chest rose again, barely enough to lift the edge of the blanket, but enough to make Caleb lean forward so quickly that the old wooden chair scraped softly across the floor. He rested 2 fingers gently against her neck, counting every fragile beat with the patience that years of training had carved into his soul. The rhythm remained weak, separated by long pauses that tested every ounce of hope he had allowed himself to feel. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the cabin, but inside the fire burned brighter, filling the room with a steady warmth that slowly pushed back the bitter chill clinging to the walls. Caleb fed another split log into the stove before returning to Freya's side, without taking his eyes off her for more than a second. He folded another wool blanket over her shoulders and carefully adjusted the dry towels surrounding her body, replacing those that had become damp from melting frost. Every movement was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. There was no room for panic, only patience. He remembered something an old survival instructor had once told him during cold weather training in Alaska. Nature does not reward strength alone. It rewards those who refuse to hurry. The words echoed quietly through his mind as he warmed another cloth with water that was comfortably warm, never hot, and gently rested it across her shoulders before moving to each leg. The stiffness beneath her fur had begun to soften, though only slightly. He spoke again, not because he expected an answer, but because silence suddenly felt heavier than conversation. You have already fought longer than most would have believed possible. You only need to keep fighting a little longer. Freya remained still, yet something about the expression around her eyes seemed different now. Less distant, less surrendered. Caleb reached toward the kitchen shelf and retrieved a small bottle of honey from the cupboard. Mixing a tiny amount with warm water, he dipped the corner of a clean cloth into the mixture and carefully touched it against her lips. At first nothing happened. Then, after several quiet moments, her tongue moved almost imperceptibly, tasting the sweetness before falling still again. Caleb released a slow breath he had not realized he had been holding. It was not much. It was everything. Hours slipped by unnoticed as daylight faded behind thick clouds, and the cabin filled with the golden glow of lantern light. Snow continued gathering outside, burying the trail that had brought them together until the wilderness erased every footprint. It felt as though the mountain had closed its door behind them, leaving only this small room suspended between winter and hope. Fatigue eventually settled into Caleb's shoulders. He had not slept properly in 2 nights, yet every time his eyes drifted toward the fire they returned to Freya almost immediately. He had spent years watching teammates through long nights, refusing to close his eyes while another life depended on him. Some habits never disappeared. Near midnight, as the fire crackled softly and the wind finally began to lose its fury, a faint sound broke the silence. It was so quiet that Caleb first mistook it for the settling logs inside the stove. Then it came again, a weak, trembling whine, barely louder than a breath. Freya's nose twitched. Her ears shifted slightly beneath the blanket. Slowly, almost painfully, her eyelids fluttered apart, revealing 2 tired amber eyes that searched the room in frightened confusion before finally meeting Caleb's steady gaze. And for the first time since he had found her beneath the snow, she knew she was no longer alone. Freya did not try to stand. She did not even lift her head. She simply looked at Caleb with eyes clouded by exhaustion, as though she had traveled farther than any road could measure just to reach this quiet room. The fire reflected softly in her amber gaze, replacing the cold emptiness that had frozen there only hours before. Caleb remained perfectly still, understanding that trust was often as fragile as life itself. He offered no sudden movement, no eager hands, only the calm presence that had steadied frightened souls long before this mountain had ever entered his life. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "That is all you need to know." Freya blinked once. Her breathing, though still shallow, had become steadier, each slow inhale carrying a little more warmth into lungs that had nearly surrendered to winter. Caleb reached for the small bowl of warm broth he had prepared from chicken stock and fresh water. Kneeling beside her, he dipped his fingertips into the liquid before letting a few drops touch the edge of her mouth. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then her tongue moved again, carefully tasting the warmth before taking another tiny sip. It was not enough to fill her stomach, but it was enough to awaken something stronger than hunger. The desire to keep living. Caleb smiled without realizing it. It was the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in months, soft enough that even he barely noticed it. Outside, dawn slowly began to brighten the eastern sky behind heavy clouds. The storm had finally exhausted itself. Fresh snow blanketed the forest in untouched white, transforming the rugged wilderness into a landscape so peaceful it seemed almost sacred. Sunlight filtered through frost-covered branches, casting golden ribbons across the cabin windows and filling the room with gentle warmth that no fire alone could create. Freya's ears twitched toward the light. She lifted her head no more than an inch before fatigue persuaded her to rest once more. Caleb gently adjusted the folded blanket beneath her neck, careful not to rush what nature had only just begun repairing. He noticed small scars hidden beneath her thick coat, old marks long since healed, each one hinting at a life that had known hardship before the mountain nearly claimed her. None looked recent. Whatever story had brought Freya here had begun long before yesterday's storm. As Caleb gathered the damp towels to replace them with dry ones, something unexpected happened. Freya slowly extended one trembling front paw across the blanket. The movement was weak and uncertain, barely reaching halfway before stopping. Caleb looked at it for a moment, then quietly rested his hand beside hers instead of over it. After a brief hesitation, her paw settled gently against the back of his hand. The touch weighed almost nothing, yet it carried more meaning than words ever could. Neither of them moved. The only sound inside the cabin was the steady crackle of burning cedar and the soft ticking of the old clock above the fireplace. For the first time in longer than Caleb cared to remember, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt shared. His eyes drifted toward the weathered leather collar resting on the nearby table. The brass tag caught the morning light, revealing faint scratches that formed another line beneath Freya's name. Caleb leaned closer, wiping away the last thin layer of tarnish with the edge of his sleeve. Slowly, one worn inscription emerged from the aged metal. If found, Pine Hollow Ranch. Caleb stared at the words for a long moment before looking back toward Freya. She had already closed her eyes again, not from weakness this time, but from the quiet confidence that she could finally sleep without fear, while somewhere beyond the frozen valley, a place called Pine Hollow Ranch waited with answers neither of them yet understood. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in pale winter sunlight that spilled across the cabin floor in long golden beams. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world so still that even the towering pines seemed to be holding their breath. Caleb opened the front door just long enough to gather fresh snow for water before closing it again against the lingering cold. Thin curls of wood smoke drifted from the chimney into the crystal blue sky, carrying the familiar scent of cedar across the silent valley. Inside, the warmth had settled into every corner of the cabin. Freya remained on the blankets near the stove, but something had changed overnight. Her eyes followed Caleb wherever he moved. They were no longer clouded with confusion. They watched with quiet awareness, measuring every step he took, every sound he made, every gentle word he spoke. Caleb knelt beside her carrying another bowl of warm broth. This time, before he reached her, Freya lifted her head on her own. The movement was slow and unsteady, but it was hers. Her ears rose halfway before settling again, and her tail gave the faintest tap against the blanket. Caleb laughed softly under his breath. "That is the strongest thing you have done yet." Freya accepted several careful mouthfuls of broth, pausing between each swallow as though relearning something her body had nearly forgotten. Caleb waited patiently, never rushing her, simply watching the color slowly return to her face beneath the rich sable fur. The cabin felt different now, less like a shelter, more like a home that had unexpectedly remembered how to welcome life. As Freya rested again, Caleb walked toward a small bookshelf tucked beside the stone fireplace. On the highest shelf sat a weathered wooden frame holding a photograph that had gathered a thin layer of dust. 3 young Navy SEALs stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a bright summer sky, smiling with the easy confidence that belonged to men who believed every tomorrow was guaranteed. Caleb reached up and brushed the dust away with his thumb. He studied the familiar faces in silence. Time had carried only one of them to this quiet mountain. The others now lived only in memory, in old letters folded inside drawers, and in moments that arrived without warning whenever the world became too quiet. He lowered the frame and sat beside Freya once more. She opened one eye, studying him with calm curiosity before gently resting her chin against his boot. The simple gesture caught him completely off guard. Something inside him, carefully buried beneath years of discipline and solitude, shifted almost imperceptibly. He had spent months convincing himself that isolation was easier than loss, that silence demanded less courage than attachment. Yet this exhausted German shepherd, who had known him for less than a day, had quietly dismantled that belief without speaking a single word. Caleb reached down and slowly scratched behind her ears. Freya answered with the faintest sigh, the kind of peaceful sound that only comes from someone who finally believes the danger has passed. Outside, sunlight glittered across untouched snowfields, turning the frozen valley into a sea of diamonds stretching toward distant mountains. A pair of elk wandered quietly through the trees, their slow footsteps leaving graceful tracks across the white landscape. Caleb glanced once more toward the brass tag resting on the nearby table. Pine Hollow Ranch. The name lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. Someone, somewhere beyond those mountains, might still be searching for the dog now sleeping beside his chair. Before he could think another thought, Freya suddenly lifted her head again. Her ears stood fully upright for the first time. She stared toward the cabin window with complete focus, not frightened, not alarmed, but deeply attentive, as though she had recognized something outside that only she could hear. Freya remained perfectly still beside the window, her amber eyes fixed on the snow-covered forest beyond the glass. Caleb followed her gaze, but saw only sunlight spilling through towering pines, the untouched blanket of white sparkling beneath a clear Montana sky, and the faint breeze stirring powder from the branches. Nothing appeared unusual, yet he had spent enough years trusting instinct over appearances to know that calm did not always mean empty. He quietly reached for his field jacket hanging beside the door. "You hear something I cannot, do you?" he asked with a faint smile. Freya turned toward him, then slowly pushed herself onto all 4 paws. Her legs trembled from weakness, forcing her to pause before taking a careful step across the wooden floor. Caleb instinctively reached forward to steady her, but she regained her balance on her own. Another step followed, then another, slow, deliberate, determined. By the time she reached the front door, her breathing had quickened, but her eyes remained focused with quiet purpose. Caleb opened the door only a few inches. Crisp mountain air flowed inside, carrying the scent of pine, fresh snow, and something else that Freya recognized immediately. She lifted her nose, inhaled deeply, then looked back at Caleb before taking a single step into the sunlight. The snow reached nearly to her chest, making every movement difficult, yet she never hesitated. Caleb stayed beside her, matching her careful pace as they crossed the clearing surrounding the cabin. Their footprints became the first marks upon the untouched snow since the storm had ended. The forest stood silent around them except for the occasional rustle of branches releasing small showers of glittering ice into the morning light. Freya paused several times to catch her breath, each stop reminding Caleb how close she had come to never standing again. Still, each time she rested, she resumed walking in exactly the same direction. It was as though an invisible thread pulled gently at her heart. After nearly 20 minutes, they reached the narrow trail Caleb had used countless times during his years living alone in the mountains. Halfway down the slope, Freya suddenly veered away from the familiar path, weaving carefully between towering lodgepole pines until she stopped beside a cluster of snow-covered boulders. She lowered her head and sniffed the frozen ground. Then she looked toward Caleb and gave one quiet bark. It was not urgent. It was certain. Caleb removed a folding shovel from his backpack and began clearing the deep snow where she stood. Layer after layer fell away until something dark appeared beneath the white surface. At first he thought it was only a fallen tree branch. Another few minutes revealed weathered cedar boards nearly hidden beneath drifting snow. It was an old trail marker, long forgotten by passing hikers. Attached to one side hung a faded wooden sign pointing deeper into the forest. The carved letters had nearly disappeared beneath years of wind and ice, but enough remained to read the destination. Pine Hollow Ranch. Caleb stared at the sign before slowly looking back toward Freya. She gently pressed her nose against the weathered wood, as though greeting an old friend she had feared was lost forever. Then she lifted her head again and looked farther into the valley beyond the trees. Caleb followed her gaze. In the far distance, barely visible through the bright winter light, a thin ribbon of gray smoke rose peacefully above the forest canopy. Someone was there. Someone was alive. Someone had a fire burning beyond the mountain. Caleb felt an unfamiliar warmth settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the sunlight. The ranch was real. It had survived the storm. And if the smoke meant what he believed it did, then Freya had not spent all those frozen hours trying to return to a place. She had been trying to return to someone. Caleb and Freya stood quietly beside the weathered trail marker, neither of them rushing toward the distant ribbon of smoke. The mountain had already taught them that surviving was not the same as hurrying. Caleb studied Freya for a long moment. Although determination still burned in her amber eyes, her breathing had grown heavier from the walk, and a slight tremble returned to her legs. She had carried herself farther than anyone would have believed possible after what she had endured, but even courage had its limits. Caleb rested a gentle hand along her neck and smiled. "We will get there. Just not today." Freya looked toward the distant valley one last time before quietly lowering her head, as if she understood. Together they turned back toward the cabin, leaving a second trail of footprints winding through the untouched snow. The afternoon sun hung low above the western ridges, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pale blue, while long shadows stretched between the towering pines. The forest felt different now. It no longer seemed lonely. It felt patient, quietly waiting for two weary travelers to become strong enough for whatever came next. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, thin smoke curled steadily from the chimney, welcoming them home with the familiar scent of cedar drifting into the crisp air. Caleb helped Freya climb the small wooden steps, opening the door before another wave of warmth wrapped around them both. Inside, he dried the snow from her paws with an old towel before guiding her back to the blankets near the stove. This time she settled down without collapsing. She lowered herself slowly, circled once out of instinct, then rested with a contented sigh that filled the room with a peace Caleb had not realized he had been missing. He placed another log onto the fire and prepared a larger bowl of warm broth mixed with softened food. Freya ate carefully but willingly, pausing now and then to glance toward him as if making certain he was still nearby. Caleb answered each glance with the quiet reassurance of someone who had finally remembered that companionship often required nothing more than staying present. Evening settled gently across the valley. The windows reflected the glow of lantern light, while snowflakes drifted lazily through the darkness outside. Caleb unfolded an old county map across the kitchen table and traced the faded forest roads with one finger until he found the name Pine Hollow Ranch tucked deep inside the northern valley beyond the ridge. The route was longer than he had expected, nearly 12 miles through terrain that remained dangerous after a storm. It would take time before Freya could safely make the journey. He folded the map again without disappointment. Some destinations were worth reaching slowly. Before turning in for the night, Caleb carried the worn leather collar from the table and fastened it gently around Freya's neck once more. The brass tag rested against her chest where it belonged, catching the soft firelight with a quiet gleam. Freya lifted her eyes to meet his, then leaned forward just enough to rest her head against his knee. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the steady warmth of another living soul beside him. The cabin, once filled only with echoes and old memories, now held something stronger than silence. It held hope waiting patiently for morning, and somewhere beyond the sleeping mountains, a ranch with a fire still burning waited for the day when one faithful German shepherd would finally find her way home. 3 mornings later the mountain awoke beneath a sky, so clear it seemed the storm had never existed. Sunlight poured across the valley, turning every snow-covered branch into silver glass, while gentle streams of melting ice whispered beneath hidden rocks for the first time since winter had tightened its grip. Caleb stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee in his hands and watched the wilderness breathe again. Behind him came the quiet sound of steady paws crossing the cabin floor. Freya emerged through the open doorway with slow confidence, her sable coat once again carrying its rich colors instead of frost, her amber eyes bright beneath the morning light. She paused beside Caleb, lifting her nose toward the crisp air before looking across the valley where the distant ribbon of smoke still curled peacefully above the trees. It was waiting, just as it had every morning since the storm. Caleb looked down at her and smiled. I think today is the day. The journey took longer than either of them expected, not because the trail was difficult, but because neither one hurried. Caleb matched every step to Freya's recovering strength, stopping whenever she paused to rest beneath the tall pines or drink from the clear streams flowing beneath patches of melting snow. Mile after mile, the forest welcomed them with birdsong that had fallen silent during the storm, with elk grazing peacefully along distant ridges, and with warm sunlight filtering through towering branches. By late afternoon, the trees opened into a broad meadow where a weathered wooden fence stretched across rolling fields dusted with fresh snow. Beyond it stood Pine Hollow Ranch, exactly as the faded trail marker had promised. Smoke drifted gently from the stone chimney of a modest farmhouse, while a red barn stood quietly beneath the mountain shadows. Before Caleb could call out, the front door opened. An elderly rancher with silver hair stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the afternoon sun. For one silent moment, he simply stared. Then his weathered face softened in complete disbelief. Freya, he whispered, barely able to breathe the name. Freya's ears lifted high. She looked at Caleb once, as though asking permission, before breaking into the strongest run her healing body could manage. The old man dropped his cane into the snow and knelt with tears already filling his eyes as the German shepherd reached him. She pressed herself gently against his chest, her tail wagging with quiet joy while he wrapped trembling arms around her neck. Neither of them made a sound for several seconds. They did not need to. Caleb remained by the gate, watching the reunion from a respectful distance. He finally understood why Freya had refused to surrender on that frozen mountain. She had not been searching for a place. She had been searching for home. The rancher eventually walked toward Caleb with Freya faithfully at his side. Gratitude filled his eyes long before words found their way into the cold afternoon air. Caleb only smiled and gently rested one hand upon Freya's shoulder. She rescued herself, he said softly. I only carried her the rest of the way. As the sun slipped behind the western peaks, casting the valley in warm shades of gold and amber, Caleb turned toward the mountain trail that would lead him back to his quiet cabin. He had arrived there days earlier believing winter had taken everything worth holding on to. Instead, it had placed one frozen soul across his path and quietly reminded him that hope rarely announces itself with thunder. More often, it arrives wrapped in silence, asks for nothing except kindness, and opens its eyes just when the world believes all miracles have already passed.